Akira Toriyama's sudden passing on March the 1st, 2024 has broken the hearts of millions around the world. It's simply staggering just how amazing and iconic his work is and will continue to be. Dragon Ball will never be the same without him, and the future of the franchise now becomes very unclear. With only a few exceptions, Toriyama has either contributed to or outright written and illustrated the vast majority of the Dragon Ball story since the original manga began in 1984. It's a story that Toriyama ultimately returned to back in 2013 because no one else could get it right, and he worked on it all the way up until his passing. Any Dragon Ball fan understands just how enormous Toriyama's influence is on Dragon Ball. This creator-story relationship goes far beyond that of other similar billion-dollar franchises. Stan Lee created Spider-Man in 1962, but many have since given us great, iconic Spider-Man stories. George Lucas created Star Wars in 1977, but many have since given us great, iconic Star Wars stories. Akira Toriyama created Dragon Ball in 1984, and I'm not sure if anyone else has given us a great, iconic Dragon Ball story. That is how powerful Toriyama's voice as a manga artist was. We know from history that when Toriyama isn't involved in the writing of new Dragon Ball material, simply put, it doesn't go very well. Of course, the most famous instance of this was with Dragon Ball GT. The original manga was over, and Toriyama was done with Dragon Ball and that brutal mangaka grind. So he let Toei continue the story themselves. I mean, of course they'd continue Dragon Ball, even though the original story was over. This Dragon Ball thing was the hottest show on TV. Get some writers from Toei to draft up a sequel anime, give Goku a new transformation so we could sell some new toys, plop it into the Dragon Ball Z slot on Fuji TV. How hard could it be? This thing was a guaranteed hit. So outside of some design work on the main characters and logo, Toriyama had nothing to do with Dragon Ball GT. He didn't even provide notes on the story, much less write it himself. There was no initial draft from Toriyama that the staff at Toei worked off of. There was no process where Toriyama would okay the scripts. Nothing. Even the stuff from GT that did endure over the years, like the Super Saiyan 4 design or some of the villain designs, it was all out of his hands. GT was poised to answer the question, what would Dragon Ball look like without the creator's input? Well, we all know how it turned out. Ultimately, Dragon Ball GT and the continuing story of Goku and friends without Akira Toriyama's involvement was a giant failure. GT's viewership in Japan dropped quickly and rapidly when audiences realized this just wasn't the Dragon Ball they remembered. Something was off. Something was wrong. Something was inauthentic and not true to the original story that took the country by storm. That special Toriyama charm that Japan fell in love with from Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball was gone. GT ran on Fuji TV from February 1996 to November 1997. A mere 64 episodes aired before it was cancelled. There was a lack of interest from the Japanese public, and believe it or not, it seemed Dragon Ball was done for good. Now, we all know how much the anime fandom despises the word filler. My earliest experience with the term comes from Dragon Ball, and it was basically described to me like this. If Toriyama didn't write it, it's filler. It's bad, and it doesn't count. Only Akira Toriyama can write real Dragon Ball. And since the release and failure of Dragon Ball GT, it seems like the higher-ups believed that very same message. Toei and Shueisha did not continue the story after GT. There was no second try. There wasn't even an attempt to right the wrongs of GT. They too seemed to follow the rule that if it wasn't written by Toriyama, it wouldn't have that authentic Dragon Ball feel, fans would reject it, and they'd just be wasting their time. And so, Dragon Ball basically stopped between the years of 1997 and 2002. Now, Western fans probably remember this time frame fondly as the time where the DBZ anime really blew up in America and Canada. But in Japan, believe it or not, Dragon Ball was just dormant. The Japanese public rejected GT, so it was almost treated like this Dragon Ball thing is done, everyone's forgotten about it, we're moving on. In Japan, there was no new manga, no new anime, no new movies, and even the video games stopped entirely. Thankfully, Dragon Ball was not forgotten in Japan. It returned in 2002 after just about 5 years of nothing, and it returned in a big way. The entire manga was reprinted on higher quality paper, color chapters intact, and an all-new ending was included with the Kanzenban release. The Dragon Ball Z anime was finally released on home video in Japan thanks to the incredible Dragon Box release. The first half of Dragon Ball Z was all yours for the low price of 100,000 yen. Video games returned as well with the release of Legendary Super Warriors on the Game Boy Color, but more importantly, the first new fighting game since 1997's Final Bout, Dragon Ball Z on the PS2, better known as Budokai 1. Dragon Ball was officially back in Japan, but it was hard to ignore the fact that this was all just repurposing old content. The cleaned up manga and anime releases were appreciated, and the games were a lot of fun, but boy, anyone from the PS2 era will remember just how many times we had to play through the Raditz fight again and again and again. The holy grail for Dragon Ball fans was something new. A new manga, a new anime or movie, something. But it seemed like Toriyama simply wasn't interested, so it wasn't going to happen. The years went by, and the fans kept themselves entertained through Dragon Ball Z video games and rewatches of the DBZ anime on DVD, the quality of which ranged from absolute dogshit to pretty good. But that's a whole other video. We continue through the 2000s, and slowly but surely, things are changing in Japan. Toriyama kept busy with various small projects like his Nekomajin manga, which wrapped up in 2005. Nekomajin slowly became a straight-up Dragon Ball parody with cameo appearances from Son Goku himself, among others. It seems like someone is getting the hunger back. Finally, in 2008, we got the Jump Super Anime Tour special, Yo Son Goku and His Friends Return. This special marked the official return of Akira Toriyama to Dragon Ball. He came up with the story and worked with series veteran Takao Koyama to finish the final version. This 34-minute special was the true beginning of this new era of the franchise we still enjoy today. The story would rewind a bit to the time period after the Buu saga, but before the final time skip. It is this time period that Toriyama would operate in exclusively, never pushing the story past his original ending. But the more accepted start of the current era came in 2013. Furious that Fox completely screwed up the live-action adaptation of his story, Toriyama got off his ass and decided that only he could save the franchise. Enter Battle of Gods, a new Dragon Ball movie written, designed, and heavily supervised by Akira Toriyama himself. Dragon Ball was finally back for real this time, really for the first time since the manga ended in 1995. This was new Dragon Ball written by Toriyama, and that means it counted. It's not filler, and that means it was going to be good, right? Well, quality-wise, there's a lot of debate among fans over how good these movies really were. But one thing can't be denied. It was a real, honest continuation of Dragon Ball. That patented Toriyama charm was all over Battle of Gods. Of course, these movies weren't a one-man operation. Many contributed to the look and feel of the movies, but in the end, there was one voice that was going to say yes or no, and it was Akira Toriyama. The success of the movies led to the creation of the weekly Dragon Ball Super anime, which of course Toriyama was also heavily involved with. Pretty much since 2013, Toriyama was back on Dragon Ball full time, all the way until his tragic passing. Dragon Ball Super Broly and Dragon Ball Super Superhero followed the Dragon Ball Super weekly anime. And in October 2023, we received word from Toriyama that he was working on an all-new Dragon Ball story called Dragon Ball Daima. Sadly, Toriyama wouldn't live to see the final product, which will air on Fuji TV in fall 2024. The whole situation becomes even more sad when you realize Toriyama wasn't just chilling out, enjoying old age, and living the retired life on a private island like Master Roshi. He was still working on awesome new stories right until the end. And so we enter the present day. This new era of Dragon Ball storytelling has all come from the mind of Akira Toriyama directly. His name simply being attached to all of this new work was a massive part of the marketing. Messages from Toriyama have basically been the main form of hype for all of these projects until they were ready to show off the actual animation in a trailer. And while we have some future content that will still be based on Toriyama's writing, eventually that will come to an end. Now, there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, and it's the monthly Dragon Ball Super manga. Shueisha hired prominent Dragon Ball fan manga artist Toyotarou to create the manga adaptation of the Dragon Ball Super anime. For most of its run, the manga adapted what we saw in the Super anime, with some small changes here and there. However, eventually, the manga did divert into its own direction, with 2 entirely new arcs that didn't appear in the Dragon Ball Super anime at all. It would seem that for the first time since Dragon Ball GT, we were receiving a new Dragon Ball story written by someone not named Akira Toriyama. Parts of the fanbase praised Toyotarou's work on the Galactic Patrol Prisoner arc and the Granola the Survivor arc, desperate to see the work adapted into anime form. It seemed like the succession plan was finally in place here. Toyotarou would take over writing the Dragon Ball story when Toriyama retired, and these arcs were like an audition of sorts. But how much of that work was Toyotarou's really? Despite the arcs not appearing in the Super anime, which we know was entirely under the supervision of Toriyama, Toyotarou himself has outlined the process of creating the Super manga, and indeed, even these 2 arcs had to go through Toriyama before being published. Each month, Toyotarou draws a rough draft of the Dragon Ball Super manga chapter, which is then submitted to Toriyama for review. Toyotarou then completed the final version of the chapter based on the notes received from Toriyama. In fact, Toyotarou recently shared on Twitter just one example of how exactly Toriyama would make some slight edits to Toyotarou's rough draft. From the latest chapter of the Super manga, Toyotarou initially had Piccolo simply fly off into the distance with Goku, Gohan, and Pan, his back to the reader. Toriyama's edit has Piccolo turning to face the reader and waving goodbye before taking off. We also get some comedy injected into the scene. We see the kindergarten teacher's reaction. We see her waving goodbye and probably thinking, what the hell, did these people just jump off the ground and fly away? Did that kindergartner just fly? This shot of Piccolo from the front, smirking as he flies off with his friends, is also a bit more dynamic compared to Toyotarou's original draft. While this may seem like a small change to some of you watching, I honestly believe this so perfectly captures the essence of Toriyama and his style of storytelling. Quite frankly, the initial rough draft is pretty boring and repetitive with very little personality or style. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Toyotarou here. Toriyama is a legit master of the craft. His paneling is second to none. It's one of the things he's most praised for, and it's no surprise he's going to notice things a younger mangaka wouldn't. We can see that even to his dying day, he always found a way to add a little spice to how the story was relayed to the reader. Make it a little easier to follow, a more pleasant read. He looked at this and had to add some facial expressions, actions, change the point of view, and throw in some humor as well. This is boring, this is fun. It's charming, it made me smile. And really, that's what Toriyama was all about. This tweet was really revealing to me, and now I'm actually curious about how the rest of the Super manga was put together. How many instances are there like this, where Toyotarou's rough draft is boring, and Toriyama kinda had to save him? It must be nice to have the master helping you out as you evolve and gain experience as a mangaka. We know Toyotarou was greatly appreciative of the feedback from his idol. Conversely, how many times was Toyotarou good from the start? How many times did Toriyama get one of these drafts and think, wow, the kid nailed it, and no additional changes were needed? If Toyotarou, a superfan who has been writing an official Dragon Ball manga for almost 9 years now, currently 23 volumes deep, if he is still struggling to capture the essence of Akira Toriyama, we may have to worry about the Dragon Ball story going forward, if indeed Toyotarou is appointed as the successor. But maybe this is a rare occurrence and we don't have much to worry about at all. At this point, it's impossible to say, but it raises a question. And it's a question I've had for years, long before Toriyama's passing. Who is going to take over the franchise? Who becomes the new Toriyama after he retires, or sadly here in reality, after he passes away? Of course, you can't replace a legend. Skill-wise, it's not going to happen. He was one of a kind. When I ask that question, I mean more so in the sense of who is the new person in charge, the final voice of authority, who is going to say yes or no when it comes to Dragon Ball going forward. We know from the failure of GT that it's not so simple to slap a Dragon Ball logo on anything and rake in the cash. If that person with the final say isn't Toriyama, there's a chance the public rejects it entirely. So it's a question that should not be taken lightly, and it'll have to be answered very soon. As I've gone over, any main story Dragon Ball content since the conclusion of Dragon Ball GT has in some way or another gone through Toriyama. He was the final voice, the filter through which everything went through. If he didn't write it in the first place, he was the one to give that final okay. And now he's gone. And we don't know how the story will continue going forward. Can it continue? Well, to that last question, I do think the answer is yes, whether we like it or not. Times have changed since the GT days. Times have changed since the days where companies would actually kill wildly successful franchises if they felt the story was over. That doesn't happen anymore. If a sequel fails, they'll try again. If a reboot fails, they'll reboot it again. Dragon Ball is a billion-dollar franchise. During the fiscal year of 2023, Dragon Ball generated close to $1 billion for Bandai Namco. That's not everything the entire franchise generates, by the way, just what Bandai Namco generates from their Dragon Ball related products like video games, toys, and other merchandise. When we add in Toei Animation's Dragon Ball cash for 2023, we clear $1 billion per year. In fact, the results for fiscal year 2023 are the strongest the Dragon Ball franchise has ever performed for both Bandai Namco and Toei Animation. It's amazingly popular, and all this during a time where there isn't a new weekly anime. I imagine the numbers will only go up when Daima begins airing in the fall. So long story short, they are not gonna end Dragon Ball just because Akira Toriyama has passed away. It can and will continue because there's simply too much money to be made. Really, the question becomes, can Dragon Ball continue and be good if it's not written by, or at least approved by, Akira Toriyama? That becomes a lot more difficult to answer because, as I went over, we haven't really seen Dragon Ball not written by Toriyama since GT. And we know GT didn't go very well. However, I am an optimist, and I'm going to say right now, I do think it's possible to honor Toriyama and continue this story in a way that would make him proud. While it may never reach the heights of the original manga and anime, I think that's a pretty impossibly high bar to clear. It doesn't have to be that special, just somewhat special. I'll settle at not horrible. Okay, better than GT. I think at the very least that is doable. First of all, I don't think it's even really fair to point to Dragon Ball GT anymore, as if that's undeniable proof that Dragon Ball could never work without Toriyama. That was almost 30 years ago, and the whole situation has changed dramatically. Kids who grew up watching Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z in Japan are now fully grown veterans of the anime and manga industry. We know for sure that there are some super talented people out there that could draw the characters just like Toriyama, or in styles that slightly differ from Toriyama's designs, but goddamn do they look great anyways. No one is complaining that some of these shots from DBS Broly aren't one-to-one with Toriyama's style. Art and animation is the thing I'm least worried about. Really, it's storytelling that's the most unproven aspect here, and it's Toriyama's totally unique style and charm that he expressed through his storytelling that is going to be the most difficult to replicate. What is that intangible Toriyama charm that is so hard to capture? Remember our example from earlier? I think this Toyotarou tweet does an amazing job showcasing that charm, almost as if he knew I was writing this video and wanted to give me a perfect example. Go back to the original Dragon Ball manga. It's still incredible to this day, and very few manga artists could ever hope to reach this level of action and excitement, combined with humor, combined with interesting lore, world building. It's all here. And it's so clean, it's so easy to read. The dude made it look effortless, and the way he guided you from panel to panel like an absolute master may be the thing that is never replicated again, no matter who writes new Dragon Ball manga material. Dragon Ball is so many different things to so many different people, and that's just a testament to Toriyama's immense, one-of-a-kind skill as an author. I think a pretty big part of that charm actually is Toriyama's background as a gag manga artist. He became famous thanks to Dr. Slump, and that shit is hilarious. Even here in 2024, it holds up so well. The fact that he was able to transition so well from such a silly gag manga to the action and martial arts themed Dragon Ball, which later pretty much became science fiction, is just another aspect of his greatness. I don't think too many people that have worked on Dragon Ball have that background or experience with comedy. It seems like most of the people working on Dragon Ball today are Dragon Ball fans, which of course makes sense. I'm sure some of them have a connection to the comedy and lighthearted stuff, but Dragon Ball is also hard-edged and serious, especially during the Frieza and Cell arcs, which are absolutely iconic. I know that was the stuff in particular that hooked me as a kid. While I can't read his mind or anything, I get the feeling that Toyotarou, creator of a super serious Dragon Ball AF fan manga, is probably more into the action and serious side of Dragon Ball, and less the lighthearted and comedic stuff. The more I think about it, the more I believe Dragon Ball doesn't work without that comedy, that levity and silliness that Toriyama was so good at incorporating into the story. Toyotarou doesn't have that comedic background, and I do worry sometimes that the silliness of the Dragon Ball world may be lost if he's the one that takes over the story and is free to move forward in any way he wants. Here's hoping Toyotarou realizes just how key the comedic stuff is when writing Dragon Ball. Another trait I heavily associate with Toriyama is the fact that his storytelling is totally unpredictable. I guess that's only natural when you plan close to nothing in advance. Toriyama himself has admitted that he wrote Dragon Ball week to week and had no idea where the story was going next. He was the master of the twist. Lots of build-up, and just when you expect the payoff, nope, that comes later. Later than you thought. Even though certain aspects of the story he was telling may have been similar to an arc that already happened, there was always a twist somewhere in there. You never quite knew where he was going next. Think of all the great transformations in Dragon Ball that catch the reader off guard. When the hero or villain is about to be defeated, a transformation takes place, changing the dynamic entirely. Just when we think our heroes are about to triumph over the enemy, an even more powerful villain appears. This stuff is simple, but it works so well, and Toriyama executed it to perfection time and time again. Oh my god, it's Frieza, he survived Planet Namek, and there's no Goku to fight him this time. Oh, another Super Saiyan is here and he killed him in 5 seconds. What? Wait, Mr. Satan is actually gonna trick Majin Buu into becoming good? Is this really happening? Oh, some really awful dude shot a dog and made Majin Buu spit out an even more evil and gray Buu that proceeds to whoop his ass and create a more powerful Majin Buu. This kind of thing happens constantly over the course of the story, and I think it's a big reason why we couldn't stop watching or reading. Another way Toriyama loves to surprise the reader is with comedy. Comedy even when the situation seems somewhat dark and scary. Many were caught off guard by Battle of Gods' lighter tone when they first watched the movie. From what I could tell, this outrage mostly came from Western fans that grew up with Z, never watched the original Dragon Ball, and associate Dragon Ball more with the dark, violent, action-heavy melodrama of the Saiyan, Frieza, and Cell sagas. But when Toriyama returned to the franchise, that wasn't at the front of his mind, clearly. He went back to his roots as a gag manga artist. He brought back Pilaf and his gang, Vegeta is making a fool out of himself, the almighty god of destruction Beerus, our first big villain since Kid Buu, is hilarious. A literal cat that just wants to eat delicious foods. No one is coming back with this after an 18-year hiatus from the franchise, except Toriyama. And that's why he was so great. He didn't care, or rather, he didn't care what the expectations were. He wasn't thinking about power levels or lore or picking up where the story left off tonally. He just did what he thought was fun, and it was effortless, and it was perfect. Is there someone capable of writing Dragon Ball that brings us the god-tier artwork, designs, and action we expect, as well as the unpredictability and twists, all wrapped up in a nice comedic bow? That is what Akira Toriyama delivered to absolute perfection every time. Well, is Oda available? In my mind, Ichiro Oda and One Piece is the closest thing to a spiritual successor to Toriyama and Dragon Ball that we've seen. One Piece started in Weekly Shonen Jump shortly after Dragon Ball ended and basically picked up the baton from Dragon Ball, becoming the biggest manga in Japan, and that's pretty much been the case for 27 years and counting. It's no secret that Oda idolized Toriyama and holds him and Dragon Ball up as a major influence. He's also managed to check the whole hugely successful, gigantic franchise love the world over box that is not too common in the history of anime and manga. Looking back at those financial reports from Bandai Namco and Toei Animation, Dragon Ball is the king, but One Piece is right there as the runner-up. But I kinda get the feeling he's busy with some stuff right now. Also, remember how I mentioned that Toriyama lays out his manga in such a simple and clean way? Oda, not so much. Oda was inspired massively from Dragon Ball, but clean and simple to read pages was a lesson he did not take from Mr. Toriyama. Thinking very optimistically, I hope Oda can contribute in some way to Dragon Ball in the future, maybe through a simple one-off. If anyone can replicate that perfect combination of comedy and action, the serious and the lighthearted, the big payoff moment where the hero triumphs, it's Oda. After all, Toriyama deemed him worthy enough to collaborate with him on Cross Epic, an awesome Dragon Ball and One Piece crossover manga. Oda is on the short list of people who actually wrote official Dragon Ball material. But yeah, like I said, I don't think he's available at the moment. So, as much as I'd like someone as experienced and talented as Ichiro Oda, with such an incredible proven track record to take over Dragon Ball, it ain't happening. Looking at things realistically, who takes over? Is it even one person that takes over? Truly, we are in uncharted territory here. There aren't too many examples I could think of quite like Toriyama, where he was so tied to a franchise to the point where I literally don't know how it could go on without him. Do you try to replace Toriyama with a single person like Toyotarou? Or do you put an entire team on this billion-dollar property? This property that the higher-ups are desperate to show to the masses that it can still be great, even without the original creator driving it forward. I think the most common theory going around is that Toyotarou becomes the new de facto leader of the franchise, or at least the main story being told through anime and manga. It makes sense to some degree. Toyotarou has the most experience working with Toriyama, picking his brain, and actually writing an official Dragon Ball manga with him for 8 years now. But I can't help but wonder, would Shueisha ever just hand the keys to this billion-dollar franchise over to one person? That's how it's operated until now, but is that how it will operate going forward? Do they want to keep that status quo where the ideas all come from one person? Will they throw armies of writers at it instead to crank out as much content as possible, as quickly as possible? Quick, we need a new Super Saiyan form, put it in the story so we could get those toy sales up. I would hope to God the higher-ups wouldn't meddle with the story like that, but we can't know for sure. Can you even capture that Toriyama charm I talked about earlier? The spontaneity of Toriyama, not knowing what is happening in the next chapter if an army of writers are collaborating together on the project, working meticulously, making sure everything is perfect with years of story already figured out. I feel like something that's too polished and too planned out beforehand is bound to miss the mark. And as we've learned, if it doesn't feel like Toriyama, people will pick up on it, and it's not gonna work. Personally, I think the best case scenario is a small team, ideally made up of people who have either worked on Dragon Ball in the past, or work closely with Toriyama and understand his style of storytelling. I think when coming up with a new story idea, if the question is asked, is this something Toriyama would do? That would be hard to answer if it was just one person coming up with everything. To do the story and the world justice, I think it's vital to at least have a small team where they could bounce ideas off of each other. Akira Toriyama is one of a kind, but maybe a team of 6 really talented people could put their heads together and come up with something almost as great. Of course, Toyotarou would be there, and he'd have this team of all-stars to support him. In the end, someone has to be the final voice that says yes or no to a story idea like Toriyama used to, and I think Toyotarou is the most qualified to be that voice based on his experience writing Dragon Ball and working directly with Toriyama. If there's someone more qualified than him to assume this impossibly difficult responsibility, I'm all ears, but I'm pretty sure there isn't. Personally, I like Toyotarou's material. He's no Toriyama, but no one is, and you can't expect that. You're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Toyotarou doesn't have the mastery of Toriyama. His action isn't as clean or exciting. The panels don't flow wonderfully from one to the next like Toriyama's panels, and he struggles with his artwork and posing sometimes. But he's improved over time, and I'm optimistic that he will continue to improve. Relatively speaking, Toyotarou is still young. From 2016 to 2024, he's published 23 volumes of the Super manga. To compare with Toriyama, he published 18 volumes of Dr. Slump from 1980 to 1985, and his first 5 volumes of Dragon Ball from 1985 to 1987. Of course, it's not apples to apples. Toyotarou has been publishing one 45-page chapter monthly, while Toriyama was adhering to the absolutely brutal weekly schedule that, honestly, probably helped make him the god we know him as today. But if we're comparing the timelines between the two mangaka, Toyotarou's experience with 23 volumes of Super published puts him around the beginning of the Red Ribbon Army arc of Dragon Ball. Toriyama still had a lot of growing from there, and so I hope Toyotarou continues to grow as well. I should also probably mention that we already have a Dragon Ball Room, a special team formed at Shueisha devoted entirely to Dragon Ball and coming up with new Dragon Ball stories. We don't have a great idea of who is a part of this team and how it works exactly, but from interviews we've learned that it was the Dragon Ball Room that presented several different story suggestions for the new Dragon Ball Super movie, which ultimately became Dragon Ball Super Broly. It begs the question, who will they pitch their stories to now? Before, if Toriyama-sensei said no, then the answer was no. Who is going to say no now? Or yes? Toei also formed a special division dedicated entirely to Dragon Ball as well. So the big dogs have their special Dragon Ball focused divisions already formed, which is great, but without the help of Toriyama, their jobs just got a whole lot harder. And I have to imagine everything I just described is up in the air now that Toriyama has passed away. This is truly uncharted territory, at least for manga, that I could personally recall. I don't think there's a protocol to follow when the original author of a manga passes away. In most cases, the story simply ends there. Some cases are different. Recently, the author of Berserk, Kentaro Miura, passed away before he could finish his manga. It was announced that the manga would be completed based strictly on plans relayed by Miura himself. The situation with Dragon Ball is a bit different. As a billion-dollar multimedia franchise popular the world over, I think it's safe to say the higher-ups want Dragon Ball to continue indefinitely. I actually think the situation we find Dragon Ball in right now has a lot of similarities to how American comics operate and have operated for decades. Many of the most popular characters in American comics were created over 60 years ago, and the stories never stopped. Stan Lee was the original creator of the Amazing Spider-Man comic, but after he wrote the original 10-year, 110-issue run, he handed writing duties off to Jerry Conway. Now, at the time, I'm sure people were thinking, it's not real Spider-Man if Stan Lee isn't writing it. He's the creator. This new guy isn't going to capture the characters properly. This is going to suck. However, Lee's successor Jerry Conway would go on to write a little story called The Night Gwen Stacy Died, one of the most iconic stories in the history of comic books, and certainly one of Spider-Man's most important moments ever. As time went on, the baton would be passed to new writers, all playing within the sandbox that Stan Lee originally created with Spider-Man all those years ago, but also putting their own unique twists on his characters and the world he created, creating all new stories for Spidey, introducing new characters. Many sucked, but some have also stood the test of time and became iconic. Decades after his original debut, and decades after his original creator stopped writing the comic, Spider-Man remains as relevant today as he did when he first appeared in 1962. And the same could be said about Goku, as we come up on 40 years since his debut in the November 20th, 1984 issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. While Toriyama is the master and he'll always be the original creator, and his run will always be the definitive run of the Dragon Ball manga, call me optimistic, but I trust that there are talented people out there that will do his work justice. I believe that talented mangaka like Toyotarou can pick up the baton and move the story forward in a positive way. Talented mangaka will create their own iconic moments, designs, and characters, much like the Spider-Man artists and writers did after Stan Lee's time. We can only hope the higher-ups at Shueisha and Toei realize how important it is to treat the franchise with care going forward, especially in this sensitive time following Toriyama's passing. They cannot put out low-effort, rushed material for a quick buck again, or start cranking out tons of crap now that they don't have to worry about the original author shooting down their dumb ideas. But of course, I'm just some guy on YouTube. I grew up watching and loving Dragon Ball. I'd safely say at this point I'm obsessed with it, but I don't have the answers. Ultimately, we'll just have to wait and see. Trying to piece together how the franchise will be handled going forward is at least interesting to think about. I really am optimistic, and I hope the powers that be can figure all this out and make Toriyama proud. But I do think with fan expectations being what they are these days, and how vocal those fans can be on social media, surely they realized they wouldn't survive another GT level effort. We already saw what happened with episode 5 of Dragon Ball Super. That was just a couple of frames from one episode. Super got absolutely slaughtered on social media because of this, and I don't think the powers that be want that kind of negative perception again. While episode 5 ultimately was an anomaly, it was something that hurt Super badly right from the get-go. If they thought that reception was bad, imagine how much worse it would be if the first new Dragon Ball material without Toriyama's involvement wasn't something of the absolute best effort and highest quality possible. The expectations will be sky high, and whether it's a manga, anime, or movie, I really think they have to deliver to assure fans that everything will be okay, even if Toriyama isn't involved. I can only hope that Toyotarou and everyone else working on Dragon Ball going forward understands what an honor it is to work on such a beloved property and treats it with the respect it deserves. Please take your time and create a well-crafted new story that feels like something Toriyama would write. Get everyone you can that worked or collaborated with Toriyama in the past to help. Without Toriyama's guidance, everyone is going to have to give their all to keep the story of Goku and his friends moving forward in a respectful way. It's a difficult task for sure, but it needs to feel like authentic Dragon Ball. This cannot be GT or Evolution because we don't have a Toriyama that couldn't come out of retirement to fix it anymore. Mr. Toriyama, thank you for everything. You will live forever through all of your incredible, wonderful, hilarious, iconic work.